So we're going to talk about what I call the fourth great American movement. But first, I want to start with a video. Let's see. I think I'm going to need somebody to help me play this video.
We meet in an hour of change and challenge, in a decade of hope and fear, in an age of both knowledge and ignorance. The greater our knowledge increases, the greater our ignorance unfolds. No man can fully grasp how far and how fast we have come. But condense, if you will, the 50,000 years of man's recorded history in a time span of but a half a century. Stated in these terms, we know very little about the first 40 years, except at the end of them, advanced man had learned to use the skins of animals to cover them. Then about 10 years ago, under this standard, man emerged from his caves to construct other kinds of shelter. Only 5 years ago, man learned to write and use a cart with wheels. Christianity began less than 2 years ago. The printing press came this year. And then less than 2 months ago, during this whole 50-year span of human history, the steam engine provided a new source of power. Newton explored the meaning of gravity. Last month, electric lights and telephones and automobiles and airplanes became available. Only last week did we develop penicillin and television and nuclear power. This is a breathtaking pace, and such a pace cannot help but create new ills as it dispels old. So it is not surprising that some would have us stay where we are a little longer, to rest, to wait. If this capsule history of our progress teaches us anything, it is that man in his quest for knowledge and progress is determined and cannot be deterred. We shall send to the moon, 240,000 miles away, a giant rocket more than 300 feet tall on an untried mission to an unknown celestial body, and then return it safely to Earth. But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why 35 years ago fly the Atlantic? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone. And therefore, as we set sail, we ask God's blessing on the most hazardous and dangerous and greatest adventure on which man has ever embarked.
That happens to be one of my favorite speeches and what I think is the most impactful speech in American history. Anybody know by chance what the connection between Lincoln, Nebraska and that speech is? There you go. Okay. Ted Sorensen wrote that speech. And I personally believe it is the last time our country rallied around some big purpose. And I think people don't realize that that speech that Ted Sorensen wrote is the reason why you can use cell phones and things like that. A lot of that actually came out of this space program. So President Kennedy said, as you heard, we choose to go to the moon, which is a 500,000 mile round trip in this decade, not because it's easy and because it's hard and because it's a mission worthy of our best efforts. So I'm going to talk about why the next mission that's worth our best efforts. So he said that, and that created the opportunity for the black female mathematicians in the movie Hidden Figures. And then Neil Armstrong said, I'm not getting into that rocket until Katherine Johnson specifically maps my way back home. Okay, now a little boring stuff here. This is about me. I kind of describe myself as an unemployable math misfit. So I was born in southern Nebraska. I mean, actually, I was born in Philadelphia, but I grew up in southern Nebraska, aka Wichita, Kansas. And I was lucky because I was born to two parents who had really great character, but they had no dough. My mother was 20 and my father was 23, and so I started school when I was 4 years old, and I just had some rules. You follow the rules, do whatever you want. So I started my first business when I was 5. I'd go around and pick up, Coke bottles to do recycling. And then when I was 8 years old, I noticed that, well, back at that time, I was born in 1960, if you were late from recess, teachers would actually hit you with paddles. They'd make you bend over and they would hit you with paddles. So I figured that these kids that went out for recess and bought gum, I could trade their money for pain, so I started a business selling bubble gum. And I did that, so it was 1969, I was making like $10 to $15 a day. 1969, that was like real money. So I always liked just the feeling of, being in my, just being in control of my own destiny. So then I worked at IBM for a little while, and my father was an executive at IBM. In fact, we moved in 1973 to Chicago. Very few of you can probably remember that time, but I was 12 years old in 1973. We moved to Chicago, and we were actually the first black family that lived in one of the suburbs called Lombard, Illinois. So you've heard of Lombard, Illinois. So I went to Lombard East, So I was the first black family there, and I had a bomb thrown in our house, and they could go home written on our lawn. And lucky my family, except me and my father, were there, and my father said, "Suck it up, we're not going anywhere." So I had this sneaking suspicion that white people like gum too. So I started selling bubble gum in school. In fact, they were buying so much bubble gum, they stopped buying ice cream. So I made a deal with the principal to sell his ice cream and my gum. So in my own view, I was like, I don't really care if you like me or not, if we can do business. So I did that. So I then went to school and I studied math, and the University of Illinois, I studied math, and then I got a job at IBM. And IBM had this very strict no nepotism rule, but everybody in my family worked at IBM. So obviously my father said, you hire my kids, I hire yours. So I was at IBM, and I remember the lady who was my manager called my father and said, I don't think your kid's stupid, but we just can't get him to talk. So I ended up writing all the algorithms would say, give salespeople signals to upgrade machines, and I figured I had done enough not to embarrass my parents. So then I left when I was 22. I ended up being a trader at the Mercantile Exchange, so I wrote algorithmic trading models, and I really liked that. Then I went to, I did a stupid thing, which you should probably never do. I funded my best friend's brother-in-law's business and had to take it over, and I turned that into a company that wrote financial modeling systems. So I would say I have no redeeming qualities other than I can add a little bit and produce a beautiful child. All right. So when I was 34, me and my father actually had a company together, and one day I went to my father, who was like the best salesman on earth, and I wasn't. I was this nerdy math guy who was already writing formulas and algorithms and stuff, and I said, hey man, I think it's time for me to go. But I started a company called Urban Fishing Development. So I bought a house on the south side of Chicago, over near the University of Chicago. Has anybody been to Chicago?
Oh yeah.
Okay. So there's a place between, if you go down Lakeshore Drive between 35th and 47th Street, that was actually called the Gap. And if you went to University of Chicago, they told you, don't go there. So it was full of public housing, and the government started to tear down public housing. And what I thought we needed was economic integration, and everybody else thought we needed racial integration. So I bought a bunch of houses, I bought a bunch of land, I built houses, I named them after famous African Americans, Paul Robeson and some scientists. And that neighborhood is today what I envision, which is an economically integrated black neighborhood. In fact, it's the only neighborhood in the black neighborhood in the country that's better off today than it was in 1968. And it's not because I'm that smart or that rich, but I think economics, like gravity, tends to work the same way for everybody. I hated construction, so then I got out of that business. But I bought a bunch of land and I gave it to some young developers who continue to develop. So what I think is that we need, our country needs what I call the fourth great American movement. The first movement was the founding of the Republic, right? The first country was built on the principle that the government exists for the benefit of the people, not the other way around. The second great, and these tend to happen once a century, the second was the removing the stain of slavery, obviously the abolitionist movement. And does anybody ever ever heard the name James Forten? Probably not. James Forten was one of the richest people in Philadelphia in the late 1700s. He was a black man, which nobody could have imagined that. He was a primary funder of a guy named Wayne Lloyd Garrison, who was a famous abolitionist. So he was an entrepreneur, and behind every great movement in our country is an entrepreneur. So the next is what I call, was after that was this, what I call the civil rights movement, which I call the one set of rules movement. And has anybody ever heard of a guy named Julius Rosenwald? Julius Rosenwald, in my view, is the greatest philanthropist in American history. In 1895, Booker T. Washington, I'm guessing some of you have heard of him, he gave a speech at the Atlanta Exposition. The essence of that speech was, America's never going to be what it can be until blacks get included in the economy. He said, we don't need to live around you, but we do have to be a part of the economy, otherwise we'll be disproportionately involved in crime and other bad things. So he sent a letter to the CEO of Sears, a man named Julius Rosenwald. And Julius Rosenwald, his parents, I believe, were Jewish immigrants, and he said, what's happening to blacks in this country is wrong. It's what happened to us in Europe. So he responded to Booker T. Washington. And together, they built 5,300 schools in the South, which is how black people got educated, because 90% of black people came from the Deep South, and it was illegal to educate them. So it is because of those two, and blacks and whites of goodwill, that black people in this country got educated. But Booker T. Washington said the purpose of education is to teach you how to be a good citizen, to be a person of good character. He wrote a book called Character Building, which is a great book. And he said to prepare you to be a part of the economy. So they started something called the Negro Business League together. And out of that, has anybody heard of the Black Wall Streets by chance? They were called freedom colonies. So out of that came the freedom colonies, which the most famous one is in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which was started by some entrepreneurs that came out of Mississippi. And within 10 years, they created a prosperous black community. And so the height of black business in our country was between 1910 and 1930. The height of black education was between 1940 and 1960. So educational achievement always follows entrepreneurial participation in the modern parts of the economy that create wealth. It doesn't lead. That is actually a fallacy. Education is important, but it's not a leader. So if we go through the civil rights movement, which you guys would be familiar with, Now, in 1968, before he passed, Martin Luther King had an interview with Harry Belafonte. And in that interview, he said, while the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act were important, they did nothing to help blacks come out of poverty. So he then started to focus on participation in the economy. So what I think now, I think a problem that we have is that young people are confusing socialism with social good. Yeah. It's not the same. So there is something called mutualism. If you've heard of mutual insurance companies, that principle is, it is based on voluntary cooperation. So in this fourth grade American movement, which is a movement of people of goodwill dedicated to proving that the free enterprise system works for everybody solely through voluntary cooperation. And that is what mutualism is, as opposed to socialism. Socialism depends on government coercion. Mutualism depends on the voluntary cooperation of people of goodwill. So I never say capitalism, I always say the free enterprise system. Putin's a capitalist. He just happens to own all the capital. Okay, so we're going to talk about what love is a verb. So I'm sure you all remember the George Floyd incident. So after that happened, I wrote a series of articles called Love is a Verb. And the theme of that is that nobody can protect or feed their family based on your sympathy. You can't eat sympathy. So, said, if you want to help somebody, go do business with them. That way, they can hire people, they can inspire people. And one of the things I think we have, and we'll talk shortly about charity, why charity focus is misguided. Okay, so here is the challenge we have in our country, I believe. We have a charity and criminal punishment focus. So, anybody here understand magnetism by chance? Any physicists? Okay. All right. So there's two types of, well, there's more than two, but let's talk about two major types of magnetism. So if you've ever seen like a junkyard and you see like a magnet, a big magnet, it'll go pick up a truck and drop it off. That is what's called paramagnetism. It depends on electricity. But as soon as there's no flow of electricity, you lose the magnetism. There's a more permanent magnet, which is called ferromagnetism. So it will stay magnetized until you raise it past the certain temperature, the Curie temperature. That's what it's called. Okay, so charity is like paramagnetism. Whenever you take away that juice or that money, it loses its effect. So the problem that we have is there is crime. In fact, we'll talk about this shortly. The problem that we have, and I would say in both urban and rural America, who have a lot of the same problems, is there's too little economic participation. We have a demand problem, not a supply problem. And if you believe what I believe is that the way you go from poverty to prosperity is through economic participation in the modern parts of the economy to create wealth that creates appreciation of education and social capital. Social capital is when you reach back and you pull people from your community along, but more importantly, you create an aspirational roadmap for your young people. So the challenge we hear, anybody ever seen the movie Goodfellas? Right, you see Henry Hill, he's looking out the window, and all the guys with the clothes, the cars, the women, they're all gangsters. So that's sending a signal that that is where the opportunity is. And that is a problem that we have in the inner city. The entrepreneur's opportunity they see is with criminal activity. And that's the only thing that they see, and that's why they go there. So it is the entrepreneur that creates a magnetic effect that pulls other people along. That is why it is misguided to focus on the many as opposed to the few. Okay, Marcus Aurelius, who was a Stoic philosopher, said, poverty is the mother of crime. And that hadn't changed in 2,000 years. So, if you ask yourself, where in the world are poor people healthy, educated, and safe? I think the answer is nowhere. Conversely, where affluent people, regardless of their race or sex or anything else, where aren't they healthy, educated, and safe? The answer is nowhere. So again, we talk about how do you go from poverty to prosperity. There is only one way, and that is entrepreneurial participation in the modern parts of the economy that create wealth that leads to the appreciation of education and social capital. Again, in social capital, you give opportunities for employment and investment to adults, and then you create this aspirational roadmap for your young people so they know where to place their bets. Okay, this is another one of my little goofy sayings. You cannot eat sympathy. People need a lot more opportunity and a lot fewer lectures. All right, so this is a hot topic today, what I call diversity, equity, and illusion. So there's if you would ask most people who benefits from DEI, if they're truthful, most people would say black people. And I'm going to say that's not true. We're actually at the bottom of the participation even in the minority category. And there's a reason why I'll talk about why everybody should care about that. Okay, so I did a study of the 2010 census, and these are the numbers. So if you take all the revenue with companies with employees, majority-owned companies would have been $9.4 trillion, women $1 trillion, Asians $455 billion, Hispanics $276 billion, and blacks $98 billion. Even though blacks have double the educational achievement on average as Hispanics. But even that's not a real number. It is a fake corporate pass-through number for people that want to get credit for big numbers, so they pass through very low margin business. In fact, companies have asked us to do that. We want to pass $200 million of spend through you, and we'll give you $200,000. That is how this system works. It is totally corrupt, insincere, and fake. Okay, so imagine how much better we'll all be when entrepreneurs of all communities participate in the economy in proportion to our talent. That is how you move things forward, in my view. So here's what we need, in my view. When you create economic participation opportunities, not set-asides, not sympathy, not lectures, but when you give people of real talent opportunity to demonstrate their value, that is how communities go from poverty to prosperity. And that is how you solve the problem of crime and other bad ills in our country. When there's more positive economic opportunities than negative, that's how communities thrive. Okay, I may have to ask you to play this video here.
Hello, my name is Scott Henderson. I'm the managing director of the InMotion Accelerator Studio, a generator program located in Lincoln, Nebraska. I want to share a quick thought with you about mutualism, which is a very important complement to the free enterprise system. It's basically when people come together of their own free will to solve problems that emerge in their local communities. It's played a very important role in our history and our economy. From the rural electric cooperatives that help electrify the countrysides and unlock all that economic potential, to the mutual insurance companies that have helped communities deal with fire, crop failure, and other disasters. And it's definitely benefited my own family. My great-grandfather, when he was faced with having to care for 3 kids on his own, had to turn to the mutual aid societies in his Swedish ethnic enclave to help him get through that time period. So if you think about it, mutualism as an ethos is the idea of paying it forward and reciprocity, so that when you benefit from the fortune of being part of a society, you can help pay it forward to those who have unfortunately seen the misfortune that life brings our way. So there you go, quick thought on mutualism.
By the way, this is a big asset for you guys. This is a wonderful man.
Hello.
Okay, So in 2009, I actually got invited to do a tour of India. And I met somebody in the central bank, and they kind of gave me the story of India. He said, in 1991, they figured out socialism didn't work. They started to free their economy, and their government started doing business with their small entrepreneurs. The biggest companies in India now were super little. But what happened is how in a period of 20 years, India and China took 750 million people out of poverty. U.S. business just did business with capable Malaysian entrepreneurs. They weren't trying to save anybody. They weren't trying to help little kids. They just did business. So I think economic cooperation of the black and white business communities always leads to progress in the country. Now, we just told that story. I'm going to skip the story of Atlanta because I got the boot. Black entrepreneurs create opportunity and aspiration. We all win when we all win. And in our community, we need, I would say, a lot more opportunity and a lot fewer lectures. So you may recognize that last picture there. There's a guy there that moved to D.C. back in 2004. But behind every great movement in our community has been entrepreneurs. That was actually Barack at my house in 1996 when I had to pay people to come listen to him. Okay, so I'm saying with business, if you want more fishermen, start buying fish. So the problem that we have is, I'm going to ask really quickly here, is there anybody here who can name two famous black entrepreneurs who would be nationally known with no connection to sports or entertainment? Can anybody name two? And Robert Blackwell doesn't count because my father's retired. Okay, we're going to, who? That's one. Who? Herman. I don't know who he is. Okay, so why does that matter? The reason why it matters is black kids can't either. The market tells them to place their bets on sports and entertainment, and that's exactly what they do. Okay? All right, play this one. This is about a minute.
My name is Micah Askew. I'm 15 years old.
He came to us and requested a new cell phone. We declined the offer. He took it upon himself to look outside, and he asked how much we were paying that gentleman to cut our grass. And later on that evening, he came to us with a business card that he created. And it started with one lady at my church. She was our first client on the west side.
We moved further and branched out to landscaping and more properties and commercial properties, whether it be hospitals, clinics, etc.
And I was listening to WVON, and I heard Robert interviewing some gentleman from University of Illinois. And at some point, Robert mentioned mowers and blowers.
At that time, we were hearing about snow removal. So at the time, we were still pretty small size. We only had one truck. We didn't have any snow materials. Once winter and fall started to roll around, we were like, okay, we have the workforce. We have the experience with landscaping. And so I think we'll be able to translate that to snow removal.
He gave us the seed money so we can buy our first sets of snow blowers.
Since the snow investment from Robert Blackwell Jr., we were able to not only start the snow removal program and that other side of the business, but we were able to obtain several building portfolios, one with 17 properties in it. Without that investment, we've not been able to do so many of the things we've done so far. My name is Micah Askew.
All right, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to see that kid can go somewhere with the right opportunity. And actually, we ended up buying him a truck from a woman, Candace Price. So we brought a truck here in Omaha and then sent it back to Chicago. All right, so the idea is if you think about just doing business, and my own view is we ought to blow up all these diversity, equity, and inclusion programs because they don't work and they're insincere. So we created something called the Lead Partner Program, which says just do business with people that are ready to do business. And in exchange for that, the people that benefit have to take the responsibility for pulling other people from their community forward. And I think that is how we're going to move our country forward. So the responsibility of the CEOs are, you don't have to hug anybody. It is not the responsibility of a company to tell their vendor how to solve their problems. All you got to do is give people opportunity to demonstrate value. The responsibility of the black entrepreneur then is to, one, identify a clear value proposition, because if you can't do that, you can't be in business. Number two, in exchange for that opportunity, take on the role of the mentor. So bring some young person or small business and make them your sub, and then take on some community enrichment responsibility. So lastly is, listen, we got a great country. We got a lot of issues we got to fix, but there's nothing that we can't fix that I think the free enterprise system can't fix. So thank you. There's the boot.